I want to talk about apocalyptic literature. My background is in um, biblical studies, Christian history and thought, and my one area that I'm particularly interested in is just like the just religious texts in general are fascinating to me because they are um, sort of created. They're not created from nowhere, right? The perspective isn't from nowhere; it's from someplace. It's from the place where people inhabit. So when we have things that are obtuse and seemingly strange, uh, sort of literature that we find whether it's the Bible, whether it's the Enuma Elish, whether it's Egyptian uh, apocrypha or apocalypses. You have all kinds of strange beings and strange events, and it's really fascinating to me. So I wanted to bring that to bear on Warhammer because Warhammer is really, really out there, really weird, but really awesome. So I will get started. Um, those of us who came of age in the 80s intuitively understand what apocalypse is. We lived through a time where the arms race between the US and Russia put the entire world on edge. We learned about mutually assured destruction on the evening news. Our television and movie media were replete with reference to the looming apocalypse. Um, oh, my, there we go. Um, we had War Games and Terminator, whose plot lines relied on the threat of annihilation, real and fabricated. Australia gave us the bleak post apocalyptic world of Mad Max. American television gave us shows like The Day After, and BBC produced the horrifying Threads. I don't that just warped me that movie, but both of these final ones depicting a possible future after the bombs fall. None of these apocalypses employed explicitly religious themes, but those of us who grew up in American Christian bubbles suffered the added horror of a spate of books and films about how Christ was going to return soon, and the Christian apocalypse thrived in this atmosphere of looming world-ending wars. Um, and I just shared a sample of just the various media that play on this sort of apocalypse with a very explicitly religious component to it. Uh, uh, get myself. So it's this religious component that characterizes the literary form of apocalypse emerging from the ancient Near East. I want to talk about this specific area. There are, going into this, there was this temptation to broaden it to include, the Nordic Eddas with these sort of apocalypses there, Ragnarok and things like that are sort of in the popular consciousness because of Marvel. Um, but I wanted to focus on this particular region of the world and the literature it produced because it does parallel how the lore of Warhammer 40K, how it comes about through sort of a process of sharing. There is an official lore that comes from the our overlords at Games Workshop who write this stuff, but they are in they're very keenly aware of what the fans are doing, what the fans like, and so this is very very much the way that apocalyptic literature in the ancient Near East came about. Um, but the ancient Near East does just for those of you who may not be familiar, it includes Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Levant, Arabia, Persia, what we might today call the Middle East, this region of the world. Um, and the people of this region have been interacting with each other for about 6,000 years. And in that time, there's been a nearly unending intercultural conversation taking place. This is a region of the world where there have been borders are certainly not permanent and never very long lasting. Um, and the people who I think uh, most of them really latch on to their nationality because their ethnicity is harder to pin down because of this just immense intercultural transaction that takes place. Oftentimes, at the end of a sword or spear, or in these days rockets, rifles, or I guess pagers nowadays, that through war people are interacting with each other, and it is in that context of war that so much of just ancient literature, period, not just the apocalyptic literature, but ancient literature um, uh, does tend to come in the context of war. And so the cultures of the ancient Near East, they were deeply religious, and these cultures became, as they became literate, they used their literary resources to write about laws and gods. Those are your two uh, pieces of literature that you will find extant today, uh, mostly because writing wasn't a matter of finding a piece of blank paper on an ink pen. It was a very arduous process, took a lot of time, and only certain people knew the language and were literate, and so only important things are written down. So legal materials and religious materials tended to make the cut in that regard. So what scholars of the ancient Near East have discovered is that the religious material, whether Egyptian, Persian, Akkadian, Sumerian, or Israelite, is universally concerned with the future. And this literary tradition is sort of the jumping off point, for my opinion, that Warhammer 40K is a modern iteration of the same apocalyptic material. So bear with me while I try and make my case here a little bit. Um, um, Much has been written about the ancient Near Eastern religions and the interrelations of the myths created by disparate people groups. Um, Richard Clifford is a Jesuit scholar, um, and he's a scholar of biblical literature, brilliant guy. He contributed an article to the Encyclopedia of Apocalypticism, which, yes, there is an Encyclopedia of Apocalypticism. Uh, and he contributed this article entitled The Roots of Apocalypticism in Near Eastern Myth. And I found it to be, this is something I encountered a while back, and when I was thinking about this, it sort of came back to me. I had to have to admit I did have to go back and dig and figure out. I couldn't remember who he was, couldn't remember the author's name. I just remember this article being really a fascinating take on myth in the ancient Near East. And this contribution has been extremely helpful for understanding where apocalyptic literature is coming from and what it intends to convey. These are two things, you have in looking at literature like this, you look at the mode of communication, but also the content of communication. Genre matters, but the content matters too. What are they trying to convey and why? And so this article he wrote expounds on earlier work of Hermann Gunkel. He did a lot of work before we even had a lot of the current literature that we have, things that had been discovered during the 20th century. Hermann Gunkel did not have in the 19th century, but Hermann Gunkel was a brilliant scholar who anticipated the things that we would discover, and he was actually right about a lot of it. But Clifford actually gives us some improved, he sort of updates Gunkel's taxonomy of this literature. And perhaps, just the most familiar examples of apocalyptic in the West are those included in the Hebrew scriptures, just by virtue of being in the West, a very Christianized world. So we tend to be, people tend to be very familiar with that, just whether or not you're a religious person, you've ever gone to church, just the culture seems to put this out. But many people in the West have also encountered the flood narrative, and the Epic of Gilgamesh is a very popular one. There, in our college humanities courses are increasingly exposing students to these kind of texts. The Egyptian texts, the prophecies of Nefertiti, and the admonitions of Epur, are two uh, works that I think are probably um, uh, most like the Christian and Israelite apocalypses. The language and the images they use are very similar. But we also have uh, been exposed to the destructive and regenerative cycle of the Hindu pralaya that exists in the Vedas. So we have, in our own culture, we're very global, sort of a cosmopolitan um, world that we tend to consume outside our own. Consume literature and media outside of our own culture, and so these are some other examples of literature that we might be, you all may be familiar with. In the case of the biblical apocalypses, their form and content owe very much to the Egyptians and their prophetic literature. So, with Clifford's help, sort of distilling some of what was in his this article on the roots of apocalypticism and the Near Eastern myth, I sort of put together some themes that are touch points common to all apocalyptic literature of the ancient Near East. These are things that you will find in all of it. And these themes can be found in the apocalypses of the past 3 millennia and in the immense body of lore in Warhammer 40K. So there are these four common themes are what I call eventual inevitability. So it sounds redundant, but I mean an eventual in the terms of events, that there are inevitable events that are going to occur. There are supernatural beings play the major role in it. There's always some sort of omnipotent or powerful monarch at the center of the stories, and it relies entirely on martial metaphors. War is extremely important to ancient Near Eastern apocalypse. So I want to start with this theme of the inevitability of events. There are the event of a future apocalypse is going to take place, and nothing you do, right or wrong, will change it. There is a tendency, especially within the biblical literature world, to sort of pair up general prophetic literature and apocalyptic literature sort of together, and they do rely on one another very heavily, but they do have some distinct characteristics, and one of them is that in prophetic literature, it depicts a moral world. It asks the reader to consider um, being good. If we do the right thing, if we act the right way, then the gods will spare us from destruction or from famine or whatever it is. In apocalyptic literature, it's an amoral sort of thing. It's, regardless of what you do, right or wrong, good or bad, these events are going to come about because there is injustice or there is a wrong that needs to be righted. And so, in this context, there is in 40K we look at the world as a world of endless war, and it's an amoral world. I mean, everybody is fighting just for their own reasons, but it's not about any um, high moral or virtuous reason. It is simply for it is simply for the self-preservation, right? So in these apocalyptic texts, there is an enemy, and he will always be vanquished, and things will be set right, no matter what the enemy does. Whoever the enemy is going to be vanquished, and all things will be set by. But apocalypse is also cyclical. There's the it's a rare thing, and I think that in Christian apocalyptic literature that seems to deal with a terminally final apocalypse where there is a final apocalypse where Christ returns to earth and reconciles everything, and then then everything just completely changes, and we don't even know what it becomes. Most apocalypses anticipate a cycle, that this apocalypse, this event that's going to happen, is going to happen, but there is going to be the necessity for another one after that to set other things right. So, understanding that these eventual inevitabilities um, are cyclical. They continue to come. And I put this quote in here from the lore, and it's the final words of Lehman Russ, from the Space Wolves, and I think it really encapsulates this the I guess the tone and content of Apocalypse. And he says, "Listen but closely, brothers, for my life's breath is all but spent far from now, when our chapter itself is dying, even as I am now dying, and our foes shall gather to destroy us. Then, my children, I shall listen for your call in whatever realm of death holds me, and come I shall, no matter what the laws of life and death forbid. At the end, I will be there for the final battle, for the wolf time." I think the wolf time is the coolest thing ever. That that they have, like, the time when this messianic uh, vision or promise comes about. They call it the wolf time. That is really awesome. But that sort of encapsulates, there is this messianic tone to it, that there's going to be this time in the future, no matter what life and death forbid, I will be there and this thing will take place. So that's this eventual inevitability. Moving on, there are supernatural beings, right? So the characters and stories are gods or other mythical beasts. This is just because it's the future, right? This is a time in the future when, we don't know what sort of beings will be among us or present to us. Then, but our imaginations can think of a lot of really creative ideas. And this is not just true of Games Workshop and 40K. This is actually quite true of the ancient Near Eastern cultures who oftentimes used the things that were familiar. Maybe a goat, a bull. Bulls were really important. That's this fertility, virility sort of symbol. Those were oftentimes serpents of different varieties and sizes, and they always had these strange beings, gods who were very other, that were unapproachable, they were not familiar. These supernatural beings are part of the stories, and because the scale of these events is so immense, and I guess beyond sort of the human ability to bring about, there have to be these supernatural forces to bring it about, right? There have to be God slaying beasts. And So some beings are conquerors, right? They're the quote unquote good guys, the guys that we like, right? Because they're going to vanquish the bad guys that we don't like. And in ancient Near Eastern literature, that's usually the people of some kingdom that's been causing us trouble, right? The Akkadians have been invading us, and some point down the road, our God is going to vanquish them for all the bad things they've done to us, right? Within the 40K lore, I mean, we have these supernatural beings, of course, but the people, the humans throughout the universe, have exposure to these beings and are affected by them in good or bad ways. Mostly bad, but there are these supernatural beings. There's always an omnipotent or a monarch that plays a key role in the story arc. Kings and queens, they're essential to ancient apocalypses. They often participate in bringing about the conditions necessary for the apocalypse, right? Either they may break a treaty with a neighboring nation. They may offend a god by trying to become like the god or to take the god's power. Sometimes they're good rulers, sometimes they're wicked, but regardless, they're all major players in literature. And of course, we have the Emperor of Mankind, the Golden Throne, um, and we have this who the Emperor of Mankind is not obviously not a good character, right? He's, I think we could probably all agree, a pretty horrible character, but is essential to the story, right? It's essential to this universe and the various um, scores that are being settled, the fight against heresy and chaos. The emperor plays a major role in that. Um, and then we have the martial metaphors, right? These are all things transpire in the context of warfare. And Clifford calls this the combat myth. The combat myth is always a battle between a god or some sort of divine warrior. In Gilgamesh, for example, is this sort of uh, demigod. There's a warrior, and this battle between them and some sort of monster that represents chaos, that represents the undoing of the divine order of things. And so apocalypses are always violent and often brutally so. And because the wicked are being punished, there's no hope found. There's uh, no, they don't save any mercy or grace for anybody. It is the destruction is absolute with no consideration of women or children or the innocent. People are going to die and things are going to be set right. And I like this quote from Captain Karn from the World Eaters. A horrible, a horrible chapter. But he says, we've all drawn blades purely for the sake of shedding blood, and we've all felt the exultation of winning a war that never even needed to happen. We are not the tame, reliable pets that the emperor wanted. Right? This is sort of encapsulates the warlike attitude, the warlike impetus for apocalypse. Right? So uh, those are my four themes, the four things that are common to these ancient Near Eastern apocalypses, but that also are shared within 40K. And again, 40K is not a single story, right? This is innumerable stories happening at different times, right? So you can go back to the Necrontyr and the Catan and all of that in the millions of years ago, and you can come all the way through Horus Heresy and into our sort of known 40K universe, and all along these these various components exist within all those stories. Um, and so, what is 40K? What does it accomplish with its lore? And just to kind of bring this together, um, primarily it's intended to make piles of money for Games Workshop. I mean, to be honest, they want to write good lore because people like me and probably most of you just fall for it hook, line, and sinker. We love it. Um, but for the fans, it uses sort of this grimdark future of the 41st millennium to bring our own historical moment into sharper focus, right? That all of this lore relies on what we already know. This is the Roman Empire, right? This is this the empire of this imperium of man is the Roman Empire. And as somebody who has spent a lot of time studying the Byzantine Empire and the sort of Eastern Christian world, this feels very familiar. The sort of blending of sort of the emperor, the sort of earthly mortal ruling power, and this sort of this immortal being of the emperor of mankind. You have this mix of, um, of sort of civic rulership and divine rulership, and so all of this has reference to some other material that we know, things that are familiar to us, and so we use it um, to talk about and sometimes make fun of. And this is something that I wanted to touch on: is that a lot of ancient apocalypses have a lot of fun at the expense of the people they don't like, right? They depict this people group, as a particular animal because that animal has some sort of characteristic that is funny or insulting. So there's a lot of play involved in this. And I think we can all agree that Warhammer 40K is very playful in its depictions, right? I play orcs, and I also have begun collecting, although not building, Leagues of Catan, because I love orcs because they're just hilarious. They are chaotic, um, and they're a blast to paint and collect. But Leagues of Catan I like because they're dwarves, they're space dwarves, and they hold grudges. They have books. They have a guy who goes into war with a book of grudges, and he reads these grudges out to people to get them to really worked up to fight. Right. So I think that's really funny. And so keeping in mind that there is there's always been a thread of humor that runs in this, although oftentimes subtly, it does make reference again to what it means to be human, right? We are very multi-layered, multifaceted creatures, and we like a little bit of humor with our horror, right? So our moment is one of acute uncertainty, the world we live in now, and I think that can be said of any time in history, in human history. People can look at events that are going around and say, well, there's a lot of uncertainty, and our moment's no different. And if you look at the view of our global landscape, and if it's to be believed, it feels very devoid of hope, right? That we are, this is something that is, as we day after day in the United States, our political situation is just, it's a train wreck, an absolute shit show. I apologize for swearing, but it's a wreck. And so we look around, and these stories in 40K sort of are a way for us to play this out and to do it in a way that is sort of satisfies us. We see our enemies being sort of um, uh, thwarted, and we see them being undermined. But paradoxically, what happens though in Warhammer 40K in the dark future, um, that it brings its fans together in a community. So we have this very dark, heavy sort of lore that is bleak and maybe yeah, I'd say it's bleak, but it's something that brings a community together by sharing stories of glorious future battles, right? That we recreate when we play the game, right? We're recreating the environment, the uh, army rules that we have, and the uh, our codices, our sort of our Bibles to play with. We rely on these things, and we get to gather together um, to have enjoy ourselves together, right, in this community, in playing this game. And honestly, apocalyptic literature really is there to unite a community. It's the thing that it does. It unites a community of people who oftentimes are beset by war, horror, famine, and it brings them together in a positive way to see a future that will play out in a way that brings about justice. And that's all I have.